It's a summer afternoon at Rupert Field in 1946, and the Negro Leagues' Newark Eagles are on the field. Mule Suttles with his high-stepping home run swing, Monty Irvin and Larry Doby, the best double-play combo ever, and Leon Day playing every position but catcher. And in the stands is Effa Manley. Oh, did Effa Manley love baseball and love her Eagles. Quite contrary to other ladies of the day, Effa took care of all the team's business. She and her Eagles ignored those that said, baseball's no place for a woman. She mother hen and managed those players all the way to the championship in the 1946 Negro League World Series. She also prodded the Baseball Hall of Fame until all her favorite Negro League players were honored. And on the day many of her players were inducted, so was Effa Manley. For she loved baseball, and it loved her back.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
There it is. There's that unmistakable theme music that you just can't get out of your head. Yes, it's that time again. Thank you so much for joining us. Good Seats Still Available. Yes, that curious little podcast journey, our little wending into the nooks and crannies of history as we try to find out more about what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for giving us a spin on your device this week, and hopefully we'll have some entertaining chatter for you this week. We are going back into the earliest days of baseball in this country, and in particular, a wellspring of unearthed stories and people and teams and leagues collectively known as the Negro Leagues. And we've had a couple of conversations prior about some of the teams, and this week we're going to get into one of those. It was a team that played in the second incarnation of the Negro National League in the 1930s, the team known as the Newark Eagles, which you historians out there probably know was a merger between two teams prior in 1935, the Brooklyn Eagles and the Newark Dodgers. Brooklyn moving to Newark to become the Newark Eagles in 1936. And through the efforts of Abe Manley, the founder of the Brooklyn Eagles franchise, and most interestingly, his wife, Effa Manley, who is going to be the topic of this conversation with our guest this week, Bob Luke, who has written a seminal book about Effa Manley's life and times. It is called The Most Famous Woman in Baseball, Effa Manley and the Negro Leagues. And I don't fancy myself as a baseball historian. As I joke with Bob, I play one on television, right? Maybe. But in my mind, and as we pursue, our little journeys here in this little podcast, to me, the Newark Eagles, the Brooklyn Eagles, the Negro National League, whatever version, all of these names and teams and leagues, these are fascinating to me. And these are what once were. The Negro Leagues in particular, of course, have a deep and rich history and are an essential part of the fabric of not only the sport of baseball, but pro sports generally, and what it led to, and frankly, it mirroring some of the struggles that still go on today, ridiculously, in this country. But it is just it is a wellspring of amazing stories and anecdotes and heritage. And we're going to be talking about Effa Manley and her contributions to the sport of baseball. And for those of you who don't know, Effa Manley was and is the first ever woman to be inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And it's interesting on a whole different bunch of fronts, right? Because that says something, a woman in the very male-dominated sport of baseball. And we've talked about that with our friend John Leonidakis about how women in baseball have had a relatively torturous history still today, even trying to break in and play the game at the same level as men. But obviously, Effa Manley was African-American as well. So that makes for a doubly interesting induction and legacy and story to tell. And look, I think it's a very intriguing discussion and understanding of how somebody like an Effa Manley in that day and age in the 1930s kind of beat the challenges of both her skin color and her gender for whatever ridiculous reasons to challenge the all boys club, shall we say, and make some stuff happen and some lasting imprint on the sport of baseball and its ability to be promoted and marketed and the talent, how to fight for the rights of players, the seeds of some of the work that she did leading up to integration of baseball, Jackie Robinson in particular, and most notably, but a whole host of other players. It's just a fascinating story, and it's one that we're going to get into with our guest, Bob Luke, the author of The Most Famous Woman in Baseball, Effa Manley, and the Negro Leagues. That is the topic of our conversation coming up in just a couple of moments. We want to remind you that sportshistorycollectibles.com is our friend and our sponsor, and we encourage you to go check them out for that perfect gift for the sports fanatic in your life. And if you're looking for items from teams or leagues that are no longer with us or iterations of franchises that do exist today but had different looks and feels back in the day, you will enjoy your visit to sportshistorycollectibles.com simply, at the very least, for the imagery that you will see on that site of all the various items that are available for you to consider. But of course, if you do see something that tickles your fancy and you want to make that purchase, well, we're here to help you with the promo code GOODSEATS. Use that promo code GOODSEATS at checkout and you will get, wait for it, 15% off your purchases. That's sportshistorycollectibles.com. Use that promo code GOODSEATS and you will get that 15% discount on all of your great memorabilia purchases when you go and use said code at said site, sportshistorycollectibles.com. And we encourage you to go there early and often. And after you finish doing that, you, of course, want to point your web browser to audibletrial.com/goodseats so that you can get your free Audible audiobook download as well as a 1-month free trial of the Audible audiobook service. By giving that a try, and by giving that a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats, you'll get to choose from over 180,000 titles across every genre known to man and woman. There's got to be one that's going to tickle your fancy and interest you. And we certainly hope that it will give you a great incentive to give an audiobook a try and give Audible in particular a spin. It's audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free audiobook download and 1 month's free exploration of the service. And remember, you can cancel at any time. So give it a try. Try it for a month. See if you like it. Enjoy the book. If you don't like the experience, hey, cancel it. But at least you tried, right? Nothing ventured, nothing gained. And it's a great way to enjoy books in an audio format. If you can't stand reading, your eyes get strained, or you just simply have a long commute, or you just you're otherwise engaged, give audiobooks a try, and Audible is the best way to do so. audibletrial.com/goodseats. And we thank you for trying them out too. Okay. One of those books that you can, I think, listen to on Audible, I'm not quite sure, but you could certainly get a copy of in printed form as well. And if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, you'll find this episode and you can click a link to buy this book. But first, give a listen to this interesting conversation with the author of that book, the book being The Most Famous Woman in Baseball, Effa Manley and the Negro Leagues. The author, his name is Bob Luke, and he is the conversation that we're going to have in just a couple of seconds, so please enjoy. Effa Manley is somebody that stands out uniquely on a number of different levels in the sport of baseball. And I'm just curious to start, before we even get into her story and her importance both during and legacy, how you even got involved in understanding and then committing the story to writing, and your background generally, how you even got to even contemplate writing such a book.
Oh, interesting question. Well, I'm a sociologist by academic training, and I worked in the field of human resource development for 40 years before retiring. And I've always been a baseball fan. I played in high school. I couldn't hit a curveball, so I didn't play in college. But I attended lots of games in the Washington, D.C. area as a fan. So when I retired, I thought writing baseball would be a great thing to do. And I wrote a book about an umpire who lived next door to me named Bill McGowan, was a major league umpire for years. He's in the Hall of Fame. And then I got interested in the Negro Leagues. I ran across them in some references to the research while I was doing the McGowan book. And I did a book on the Baltimore Elite Giants, and in that book, Effa Manley played a major role. And so that got me interested in Effa Manley, and I started researching her and decided that was, worth my time to write a book about her. As the only woman in the Baseball Hall of Fame, she went in as an executive, of course. She ran the team, but and she was what today I think we'd call a general manager, and probably some other roles. But she was also very, very active in civil rights. She led a number of protests in Harlem in the mid-'30s. She was active with the New Jersey NAACP branch. She gave proceeds of games to institutions that worked with African-American youth. So there's more to Effa Manley than just her baseball involvement.
So in your process, maybe that's also something we can get to before we kind of sort of begin sort of her journey, so to speak.
Okay.
What is give us a sense of, because you're not a professional writer, quote unquote, by trade. Obviously, in the academic world, I'm sure you've did plenty of academic research and writing, but writing a book and trying to convey it to more general audience is a little different. So maybe a little bit of insight as to your process of, okay, and frankly, we should probably talk about the Baltimore Elite Giants at some point separately, because that too is an interesting and compelling story. But I'm curious as to what your process is in terms of research and understanding, and then how do you even thread that into a narrative to tell a story?
Well, that's a great question. That's something I had to learn. I really had no idea how to do that. And as you say, it's very different than academic writing. I talk with some friends of mine who are professional writers, and that was a big help. My research project, I spent a lot of time at the Library of Congress, where they have old newspapers that have been digitized, and you can find out practically anything you want to know about. I went to Newark, New Jersey, where in the public library in Newark, they have Effa Manley's correspondence on microfilm. So I went through all that. And then I just started trying to tell the story somehow. Did a couple of drafts of the book and got a lot of help and feedback from my editor, who kept nudging me toward the narrative style of writing. And so I think it's largely a story of trial and error with help from friends and basically writing professionals that helped me get to the place where I could put a story together or a narrative together that a publisher would be interested in publishing.
Well, so how did that narrative begin? Because I think, and again, the book we're referencing, of course, is The Most Famous Woman in Baseball, Effa Manley and the Negro Leagues. And that's quite something, right? Because as I said earlier, her story, right, is one of many parallels, right? Obviously, being an African American woman, just generally in society, especially in the early to mid 1900s, not the easiest of experiences just by that. Second, the fact that she's a woman, right, in a very male, almost exclusively male-dominated sport of baseball. And then third, the dynamics of the sport of baseball itself, right, which is, reflective, sadly, around some of the mores of the time, the sort of separate but equal, craziness and all that stuff. And just this rich cultural and talent bed of the Negro Leagues. How does this, aside from, the normal, she was born in, blah, 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 how do you kind of start this story? Is it because of her, shall we say, African-American femaleness? Or is it a story of a young girl who falls in love with the sport of baseball and decides to do something with it, despite her seemingly ill-prepared background, shall we say?
I would say it's really a story about Negro League baseball using the Newark Eagles as the theme and Effa Manley as the main character. She was a big baseball fan and would go to Yankees. She had a job in a millinery shop in New York and lived in New York and would go to Yankee Stadium to see Babe Ruth, who was her big baseball hero. And that's where she met her husband, Abe Manley, who ran numbers and was into real estate and made lots of money. And the two of them got together, and he put up the money for the team, and she basically ran it. And it's also a story about her character. I mean, she was just, as you say, she was a woman in a man's world. She was black in a white world. But she was just very determined and focused and full of self-confidence and moved right ahead. She met a lot of resistance from the owners of other Negro League teams who were male and thought she should be home in the kitchen, and said so to her face in meetings. She just kept at it. She had the support of her husband, and she just became a driving force in getting the Negro Leagues to take a more organized and business-like approach to the league and to its finances. And in addition to all that, she ran the Newark Eagles, took care of the players and the advertising and the ticket sales and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so let's talk about Abe Manley and the Newark Eagles, right? Because this is this obviously sort of opens the door into what this team was, in what league and circumstances that they played. But maybe before getting to that, we maybe get into like who this Abe Manley character is. Obviously, the person whose surname that she wound up taking and keeping for the rest of her life. Maybe you can give us some background as to him and how what the Newark Eagles were all about, and the Negro National League in particular, in which they mostly played.
Sure. Well, Abe was born in Hereford County, North Carolina, in a black community. His father put him to work in a sawmill, which he didn't like, and he inadvertently cut off his right index finger. Came home, bandaged it up, left home, went to Norfolk, Virginia, and got into a variety of jobs. And then at some point, I don't know exactly how, but at some point he got into running numbers and buying and selling real estate. And by this time he had moved to Camden.
Now, when you say running numbers, that has obviously a little bit of a connotation there, right? You want to explain maybe to our youngins here that what that really means, positively or negatively?
Well, back in the day, it was an illegal lottery. A person would bet a certain amount of money that a certain row of numbers would show up in the newspaper. You could bet that the numbers 351 would show up in the person's account that was running the game, and if it showed up, you got a payoff. If it didn't show up, you lost your money. At that time, it was illegal. Today, the lottery is legal. It's basically the same process. Only in those days it was illegal. And Abe Manley and other number runners did all of that under cover. They had people working for him who looked out for the police and one thing and another. And it made him a lot of money, made him a lot of enemies. Somebody bombed his house in Camden, New Jersey, and he was advised to leave town. So he did, and he moved to Brooklyn, which is where he met Effa, and his first team was the Brooklyn Eagles. They were voted into the National Negro League as the new team, and they, like all expansion teams, picked from available players, didn't get the best players, didn't have the best season, and so he decided to move from Brooklyn and New York over to Newark, where he thought the team would basically make more money than in New York.
Actually, before we cross the Hudson River, how does he get involved in the idea of a national Negro National League team. I mean, and given that background, right, with, perhaps real estate, okay, a little bit above board, but right, the numbers running, clearly not so much. How does a prospective owner, shall we say, in a team, in a league, how does it even occur? How does he get a franchise, so to speak? Was he well vetted? Was the process a little less than strong in terms of that assessment? I'm just curious as to how you would think, just curiously, how does somebody like that with a interesting, questionable, and or sometimes with a bunch of folks who aren't necessarily enamored with his business style to actually get a franchise?
Well, interesting question. He approached the owners of the other Negro League teams in the National Negro League, Gus Greeley and Posey, and they were all of like ilk. They were all running numbers and into real estate, and they had bars. And from the white establishment point of view, the whole operation of numbers and bars and so forth was seen as shady and a lot of it illegal. In the African American community, it was a life support system for lots of people. That's where they made their money. That's where they socialized. So Abe fit right into the African American baseball team owners. They were all doing the same thing.
Got it. So he was essentially already kind of, quote unquote, one of them, so to speak. So it was kind of a natural thing for him to pursue. That's interesting.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how does Brooklyn in its first year go, and what convinces him to go to Newark and sort of that process? And of course, when is Effa sort of come into the story? I think it's a couple of years later, no?
It is a couple of years later. This is, I think it's 1935, 1936, the Brooklyn Eagles' first season, and they do terribly. They come in last place. There are two other Negro League teams in New York. There are 3 major league teams in New York. There are a lot of semi-pro teams in New York. So the combination of coming in last and becoming aware of all the competition were the two kind of forces that prompted him to go to Newark and start up the Newark Eagles. And this is, I think, 1937, thereabouts. And Effa doesn't come into the picture until, as you say, a year or two later. And when she starts going to meetings of owners with Abe, and she starts making suggestions about how the league could be better organized and make more money, and her initial thoughts are shot down by the rest of the owners. And then it turns out that Abe at one point says to Effa, I don't want to be caught up in all the administrative details of the team. I want to hang out with the players and drink with them at the bar and go to spring training with them and that kind of thing.
Typical male, yeah.
Right. And would you run the team, please? And she did. Abe would pick out the players. He was sort of the chief scout. And Effa would draw up contracts with the players. She would negotiate with the players. She would find them places to stay. She would sell tickets and hire publicity men and do all that business associated with really administering any baseball team, and this one, the Newark Eagles. And she would go to these meetings, and they would just be very conflicted meetings where she would, suggest how they could, for instance, change lower ticket prices for the Negro League All-Star game. That she thought that would attract more people. In the long run, they'd make more money. And that was an example of a kind of suggestion she would make, which was, at that time, totally shot down.
Well, where is she getting her moxie and or her, I guess, sort of quote unquote qualifications? I mean, had she had any sort of marketing and or business experience per se, either directly or indirectly related to baseball and sports management, or how does, or is she learning by sheer will and just cunning and logic and intelligence, or how does she even get the sense that she's as a viable voice in all of this?
She had a very strong commitment to improving conditions for African Americans. She would talk about doing things for the race, as she put it. She would say at these meetings, we're talking about more than making money. We're talking about the race, and she saw Negro League baseball as a thing that could grow, create more jobs for African Americans, provide African Americans with more sanctuary kind of places that they could go and not be hassled by the white population as they were in those days. So her driving force was improving the conditions for African Americans. It happened to be in the arena of baseball because she was married to Abe Manley, and she herself had an interest in baseball, but she could have performed equally well in any other field of endeavor: insurance, funeral parlors, hotels, given that drive to improve conditions for African Americans. Plus, she had just a lot of native intelligence, a lot of self-confidence, is a great role model, I think. She had a high school education. She didn't go to college.
What was her source of income and her support before meeting Abe? I mean, was she, any documentation of sort of the kinds of jobs or other interests that she was doing prior to meeting Abe and then becoming launching her baseball career?
She worked for 10 or 12 years in New York City in a millinery, I think it is, shop where they make dresses and hats for women. That was what her mother had done, and she learned those skills from her mother. I got a job with them in New York City, and she was light enough skinned that people really didn't know she was African American. She probably would have had a tougher time if they had known. So she did that for 10 or 12 years. She also got into modeling. She was a very attractive woman, and she would model clothes at fashion shows and make some income there. So between the millinery store and the modeling provided her with enough income to support herself. And then, of course, when she met Abe, he bought her diamond rings and fur coats and drove her around in his chauffeur Lincoln limousine.
Yeah, you can imagine what the courtship might have looked like. I can imagine. I can hear the music. I can see the scene already.
Right.
All right. So, but one little footnote, right? We kind of glanced over here. When Abe decided, this is obviously before Effa, but when Abe decided and his management, or maybe him, decided that they were going to go from Brooklyn to Newark, there was already, though, a team in Newark, right? And wasn't there some kind of merger or some kind of, I don't know,
yes,
agreement? I mean, how did that sort of come about? Because I can't imagine you're not going to have two teams in Newark, of course, right?
No, right. No, you're right. There was a team in Newark, the name of which is the Newark, might have been the Newark Browns. It escapes me what the name of that is. But you're right. There was a team in
the Newark Dodgers, ironically, right?
Newark Dodgers.
You think,
you're right.
Yeah, ironically, not being in Brooklyn, of course, but that's interesting.
That's right. Right. That's right. And those two teams merged, and the Newark Eagles came out the surviving team, taking some of the players from the Newark Dodgers, one of whom was Leon Day, pitcher, who went on to the Hall of Fame and spent a lot of his career with other teams. Didn't get back to the Newark Eagles until 1946.
Before we go further with the Eagles itself, and then and Effa Manley's involvement more deeply with them, can you give us a little bit of a scene set about the Negro National League that they were part of, right? Because this was actually, I think, the second incarnation of the Negro National League, or maybe you can give us a sense of that and just the Negro Leagues generally in terms of how they were structured. And the various teams and stuff, how they were, how they were situated back in the day.
Okay, sure. I'll try and do that. There had been Negro League baseball since the days of the Civil War. Barnstorming teams playing in different parts of the country. 1920, Rube Foster in Chicago organizes a league. He brings 6 or 8 teams together, form a league. They play games with each other, as happens in a league. The Great Depression comes along. The league cannot survive financially, goes out of business for a year or two, and then reemerges at about 1933, and you get the collection of owners. Negro Leagues did not have much of a sense of organization. They played as many games as they could. They rode buses. Of course, they couldn't eat and stay at white establishments, so they suffered a lot of that kind of discrimination. The players on the teams, if they got a better offer in Mexico or Puerto Rico or Cuba, they would simply leave, or as they say, they would jump their team to go south and double and triple their salary, and then they would come back, and all was forgiven. Even though that rankled Effa, she thought there should be penalties for players who jumped and came back, but they were such box office attractions that they brought in the money when they showed up. So it was an ill-organized operation on any front you want to think of. One of the things that kept the Negro Leagues together was that a Negro League game, provided African Americans a sanctuary where they could go and just be themselves, and they didn't have to worry about all the discrimination they were facing in their day-to-day lives. So they would take beer and liquor and fried chicken, and the games were often scheduled to start right after church, so they all came very well dressed to the games. So it was its own society, kind of.
Yeah, it almost seems like a parallel universe in some respect, right? Which
yes.
is bizarre, but understandable given the times, right?
Right. That's and for that very reason, the Negro Leagues were looked down upon by people like Branch Rickey, who is well into working in the major leagues where things were a lot better organized. So he gave. He didn't think very much of the Negro Leagues, and as a matter of fact, would just go in and take a player or two from the Negro Leagues without paying the team anything or talking to the manager. That's what he did, for instance, with Jackie Robinson. He just talked to Jackie Robinson when Robinson was with the Monarchs and said, "Would you like to play with me?" And Robinson said, "I sure would." And so he got signed, but the Monarchs got nothing for it. And some of that happened with Effa and the Newark Eagles as well.
Well, so in steps Effa Manley into this world, obviously of men, obviously of an interesting sort of parallel sort of business approach or not business approach to running baseball franchises, albeit in the Negro Leagues, which were obviously sort of a different and parallel kind of universe to that of what was then Major League Baseball. Maybe you can give us a sense of sort of how she becomes more day-to-day and involved, and maybe in sort of the manners in which she does become involved. It seems like marketing and promotion was certainly a thing of hers. It also seems to me that she was quite creative, shall we say, in terms of how to think differently, perhaps. Maybe with a sort of a more I want to call it naive, but sort of outsider's perspective, right? Which arguably could have been a great breath of fresh air, given the similarities of these owners of the other teams in the league.
Well, that's true. I thought marketing was a large part of what she did, and one place she concentrated her marketing efforts was on opening day. She would make an effort to bring in a lot of big-name people, such as Joe Louis, the senators from New Jersey, to attend the game, throw out the first ball, the first pitch, to get the season off on a good start. And she would do more, less visible things like pick a white printing company to print the tickets to the games, thinking that the white printing company could get the tickets to potential white spectators more easily than could a African-American printing company. She was all about getting people into the stands to make as much money as possible for the Eagles. And at the same time that she was marketing, she was negotiating with players to get them signed for the least amount of money she could get away with. So a lot of her concern, in addition to doing things to bolster the race was to bolster the bottom line of the Eagles.
So, but she was also, I guess, part of the mix of handling scheduling and contracts and all those. So it seems to me that she, was truly, to your point earlier, becoming or maybe even defining the role of what is today known as a general manager.
Well, that could well be. That could well be. That was certainly a lot of what she did, and I'm not that familiar with what general managers on major league teams did in those days, but she was certainly the administrative force behind the team. Though at the same time that she did that, Abe maintained authority over who played for the Eagles. I mean, he would go out. He had friends he'd talk to and scouts and so forth, and he would pick players. Like he picked Monty Irvin up from high school in New Jersey, seeing him play on the Sandlots, and he picked Willie Wells as his shortstop when Wells left the Chicago Negro League team. Effa didn't have much to do in recruiting players. That was really Abe's forte. But once the players arrived, Effa took over.
All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 1-month trial of the Audible service, and most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly, that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Bamer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also, in my queue, next up, is another guest that I'd like to get, and her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeanie Buss, and of course, Jeanie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course, the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum, and Jeanie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those 2, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. Are there any distinctive promotions or marketing efforts or innovations in your research that you could remember that she kind of brought? I mean, the fact of, I guess, the idea of opening day, certainly, right? That's the ultimate. The All-Star game you mentioned, right? You know, the ability to, or the idea of lowering prices, right, to get sort of perhaps the more casual fan and then get them sort of hooked on the game and then come back. Any other things or dynamics that she brought into the mix, and maybe some that actually didn't take root or were completely rejected, so to speak?
Well, a lot of her suggestions to the owners were rejected. She did have an interesting relationship with Satchel Paige, who at that time was a preeminent pitcher for the Negro Leagues and probably one of the best pitchers in all of baseball. He was trying to strike up a relationship with her. And in the course of that, signed a contract to come play for the Eagles, only on the condition that he could engage in a relationship with Effa, which he declined. And so Satchel Paige never showed up. And Abe Manley was out $5,000. He had paid Gus Greenlee $5,000 to get Satchel Paige from the Pittsburgh Crawfords. But in terms of innovations that Effa came up with, other than the ones we've talked about, I can't think of any. I mean, she did the normal getting the word out through newspapers, publishing scores, putting posters on telephone poles, calling newspapers ahead of games to make sure they had a reporter there to cover the game, that kind of thing. But I think that's all fairly standard operating procedure.
It seems though she also, whether you want to call it promotion or just more broadly, used the team quite effectively to help advance the general causes of the African American community writ large, sort of tying in games playing and benefit fundraising and associated causes. It seems like she was very active in trying to commingle those two intertwined issues, the plight, if you will, of African Americans in this country, plus a team which could arguably be seen as a beacon of hope and of commerce and opportunity. I see some, in some of my research, I see various benefits that they sort of hosted, and I think according to the Baseball Hall of Fame website, that one of the benefit games featured if you can imagine this, a stop lynching theme.
I saw that in my research, and I've seen that a number of places, but I have never been able to verify that actually took place.
Interesting.
All the newspaper research I've done, I even asked Bonnie Irvin that question. He didn't remember an anti-lynching game. He played with the Eagles from like 41 to 48 with 3 years out for service in the Army. So then that game may well have taken place, but it's always intrigued me that I couldn't find, any primary source verification of that.
Well, it is interesting, and we could quibble or about the specifics per se, right? But the idea is that, look, she's female, she's African American, and she's in a sport that is arguably very closed on a number of different levels, right? So she's kind of got a whole bunch of things kind of in her favor, and uniquely so. And I think it seems to me that's kind of one of the reasons, maybe the key reasons, that she was the first woman inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame, right? Because she was such you could say just by being there in the midst of that, in her position, was substantial and influential by itself. But the fact that she was able to achieve so many interesting and compelling things, and we'll talk about maybe probably her most lasting and notable thing in a second, but it had to be not sort of the easiest path, right? Because there weren't many people to emulate, so to speak, in her role. But just by the fact of her background and her situation, right? She, in many respects, had a great opportunity to change the dynamics on a number of different levels in the sport of baseball, and frankly, even more broadly.
Yes, indeed. I think she certainly did. I don't know how much she ended up in the long run changing baseball. She gave a lot of life to her team and players, so forth. But as you know, eventually once baseball became integrated, that was a death knell for the Negro Leagues, and they just ceased to exist because all of the stars went to the majors, and so that leaving the Negro Leagues as an interesting piece of baseball history, but as an organization or institution, they just ceased to exist, unfortunately.
Well, that sort of brings up, I guess, one of her greatest and most notable contributions was, and so you mentioned it earlier, but people recall, right? When people like Jackie Robinson were signed, quote unquote, by Branch Rickey, you mentioned and hinted at, the lack of compensation for such, right? So you can imagine, an amazing talent such as a Jackie Robinson being tapped on the shoulder and being asked if, he wants to play in the quote unquote big/major leagues. And you can't imagine a player of any color or skill set, turning that down, right? And you're hinting at this, and this is an issue that continues to this day. You look at world soccer, for example, right? Transfer fees and whatnot. There were no such things as transfer fees who holds the rights to these players? Well, ostensibly, they would be the teams in the Negro Leagues, right? But they kind of weren't necessarily, or maybe not sort of ironclad legally, I guess. So it seems to me that Effa Manley, and it would be interesting to know, specifically with relation to players on the Eagles, but it seems to me that she was one of the more vocal voices of, and maybe even change agents to kind of help rectify this issue and say, okay, if integration is starting, huzzah, right, which is a major feat in and of itself, but there are consequences and or business realities to that, and how do you sort of change that so that we're not getting the short end of the stick financially, because there's Jackie Robinson is just the start of so many great players that are possibly additive to these major leagues.
Well, you're right. She did have influence on the compensation issue. Ricky also took Don Newcomb from the Eagles, a pitcher, without any compensation to the Manleys, and that really got Effa very angry, and she wrote a lot of newspaper articles about it and gave speeches about it. And then when Ricky approached her about Monty Irvin, she said, you're going to have to pay me or I'll sue you. And she actually threatened to sue Ricky. And upon hearing that, Ricky just dropped the matter, and Effa Manley got Monty Irvin a contract with the New York Giants and was paid for that. So that the other thing she was helpful in is when Larry Doby got the attention of Bill Veeck with the Cleveland Indians. He owned a number of teams. At the time, he owned the Cleveland Indians. And she insisted that Veeck pay her $5,000 to give Doby a tryout and $10,000 if Veeck kept Doby. And Veeck agreed to that. In many ways, Veeck was very helpful in getting compensation to Negro League teams. Veeck had a different take on things than Ricky did. Veeck, I think, characterized the Negro League teams as they're not that bad, they shuffle along, whereas Ricky just thought they were an exploitative system of owners exploiting players. So Veeck and Effa made an effective team in providing the precedent, I guess you'd call it, for compensating Negro League teams for their players.
Well, it's also interesting, too, because, the team, the Eagles, were they essentially reached the pinnacle of the Negro League playing and playoff system by winning the Negro League World Series in 46. And it's an interesting time. It almost feels kismet, right, in terms of timing, right? Because in 47 is when Robinson went into the quote-unquote major leagues, right? And so, maybe we should talk about that team, because that was, really the Eagles' only, was the only championship that they ever achieved. And then that year, you mentioned Larry Doby, but they had a whole roster of what became future Hall of Famers, right? I mean, you mentioned Doby, but Monty Irvin and Biz Mackey and Willie Wells and Leon Day and Ray Dandridge, Mule Suttles, one of the better names. Let's back up for a second. How does a team like that with such great, stunning talent get assembled? I got to think that Effa had a hand in that. And then second, would you say that the success of that year's team was almost extraordinarily well timed, given, or perhaps maybe it was part of the motions around the beginnings of integration and seeing that African American players are hugely valuable and potentially very lucrative to the quote unquote big leagues?
Well, I think they're winning the championship in 46, right? Put the players' skills on display in a broader way than had they not been in the World Series. So people were coming to the conclusion that the African-American players really were terrific players and had lots of skills. In terms of how that team was assembled, it was a very number of factors involved. Some of the players decided they did not want to play in South America. Willie Wells and Dandridge, for instance, had jumped the team a year or two earlier, but they decided they wanted to come back and play for the Eagles, and Effa said fine. I think Leon Day arrived, some kind of a trade. It was fortuitous. I don't know that you could really say it was planned. Biz Mackey refused to play the year before because Effa wouldn't send him an extra $25 for train fare, but the following year she sent him enough money to make him happy and gave him a 2-year contract, and so he came around. Was a lot of combination of circumstances and negotiation that got that group together, and of course that was the highlight for the Eagles, and they just won that World Series by the skin of their teeth. It was down to the last game. I think they were playing Kansas City, and they won that 7th game by 1 run. It was the bottom of the 9th. There were 2 outs, 2 Monarchs on base, and the Eagle player popped up for the 3rd out to give them the title. And that, I think, was the baseball highlight for the Manleys.
Well, and we touched upon this very briefly in our conversation with about the Kansas City Monarchs with Bill Young. They were not favored, the Eagles, right? So, clearly not only winning sort of by the skin of their teeth, but it also, seems so, besides sort of the the background, I guess, of looming integration, or at least of players finally being seen as being valuable contributors to these big leagues. It also seems that Manley, sort of saw perhaps a little bit of the writing on the wall, right? Because not too far after winning that championship, they sold. She and her husband sold the team, and a lot of the league sort of kind of went sort of downhill, I guess you could say, sort of from that. Now, again, maybe just timing, but what do you think she and Abe kind of saw? Having won that championship, I mean, do you give them? Do you think in hindsight they kind of saw the writing on the wall that maybe this was sort of the beginning of the end of this sort of rich Negro League kind of system, or do you think it was just good timing and they wanted out for other reasons?
I think they saw the handwriting on the wall. I think once Newcomb and Robinson and Irvin and Doby and so forth went to the majors, the attendance went down noticeably for Eagles games and the other Negro League team games. So, I mean, they could see the beginning of the end, which made Effa very angry and frustrated, and she blamed the African-American public for going to the Major League games instead of continuing to come to the Negro League games. And so in a peak of frustration and wanting to get out from under all the financial burdens, I think Abe Manley figured up he spent something like $100,000 or lost $100,000 on the Eagles, which was real money back then. They decided to get out of baseball and sell the team, and I think just too much for Effa to cope with. She was just so frustrated. She said, "This is not worth my time."
Well, it seems like it's also. I'm sorry. It also seems like it's a sort of a double-edged sword, right? So the sort of the ultimate, I guess, victory, so to speak, by seeing at least one and then a few other Negro League players being valued and seen as opportunistic, I guess, for for the big leagues. But it's also it does potentially injure or question the Negro Leagues from which these players came from. If I'm not mistaken, and I am no baseball historian, I just play one on television. The idea of, Jackie Robinson himself, right? I got criticized, I think, from Manley herself in particular, because it's my understanding that Robinson, made some allusions, I guess, to the relative informalities, I guess, of the Negro Leagues relative to, say, that of big league baseball, which I think probably got added to Effa's sort of peak you mentioned, because, she's kind of like, well, wait a minute. Understand where you came from, and the reality is that, for decades, we've been able to help sort of promote the this opportunity, this situation, this possibility. So I got to think it's doubly frustrating and truly a double-edged sword, right? So it's a win generally, but obviously from a business perspective, also kind of a curiosity.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. She took great issue with Robinson. He published an article in a magazine taking the Negro Leagues to task for lack of organization and long bus rides, and he had a lot of complaints that he aired publicly. And he also did that in a speech he gave in Washington, D.C., and you're absolutely right, that did not sit at all well with Effa for those reasons, sort of, casting your own mother aside.
So why do you think once the team was sold and there's ample research to show sort of how, the National League and the American League of the Negro Leagues merged and, obviously started to whimper and wind down, obviously, as integration became much more of a common and just frankly straightforward process after that. Why do you, I'm curious, because I'm not quite sure what happened to her and Abe in their professional careers after that.
Okay.
You'd think that, I just don't know. That's why we have conversations like this. You'd think, I think that she would have been somebody that the big leagues would have benefited by having on the inside.
Well, you're absolutely right. They would have, and they could have, but they didn't. They just were not into hiring African-American women for executive positions in their front offices. After the team was sold, Abe died in 1952, left all his money to Effa. Effa, she loved music. For a period of time, she opened a music store in Germantown, Pennsylvania, not far from Newark. And then she goes to, and at this time, she becomes very active in the NAACP. She becomes the treasurer of the New Jersey NAACP chapter. Then she moves to Los Angeles. She is married 2 times and divorced 2 times in Los Angeles. She gives a number of interviews. And the Dodgers, who now have moved to Los Angeles, do give her a lifetime pass to come to any game she wants to. So while they wouldn't avail themselves of her skills and experience, they gave her a free pass to come see any game. And Effa, she continued to listen to music. That's what she talks about a lot, and ended up dying in the rest home run by Quincy Troop, himself a former Negro League player, a catcher, as she died in 1983 in Los Angeles.
Yeah, do you think, so it's hard because, neither of us ever met her, but, do you think that she would consider herself, or would have considered herself, maybe in some of the interviews afterwards, this could have been divined, as a pioneer? Do you think she felt that she did have some impact, or do you think she perhaps just felt she was just doing what was naturally right, even though she never really continued in baseball after the Eagles were sold?
I think more the latter. She did try to keep the history of the Negro Leagues alive. She co-authored a book about the Negro Leagues with Leon Hartwick, a sports writer who also had moved to Los Angeles, and she gave the names of 70-some players from the Negro League she thought should be in the Hall of Fame. And She would do radio interviews and that kind of thing. But during the time she was active with the Eagles, she would always deflect the credit to Abe when people would ask her questions about her contribution and so on and so forth. She would say, "Oh, I'm just doing, as you say, what needs to be done." Abe really is the baseball genius in the family. So I think she'd probably be pretty surprised to learn she's in the Hall of Fame.
Is there any story or any background as to her actual election into the Hall of Fame? I mean, she was the first woman inducted. And I'm just curious if there was, in your research, maybe you haven't touched on it or understand, but and I don't either. Was there anything? Was there any sort of sensibility, or I wouldn't even call it, politicking, so to speak? But I'm just curious as to how she was surfaced as that significant addition and contribution. And I'm also wondering too the timing, right? Because she was inducted, and I apologize for not knowing the year that she was inducted. I'm just curious as to what was going on around that time, perhaps as to why that period of time where she was inducted.
Well, previous to her being inducted, which I think was like 1996, 97, I think
that's right.
A whole group of Negro League players were inducted at that time, 12 or 13. And she was one of them as an executive. There had been a lot of criticism of the Hall of Fame that they did not have Negro League players in the Hall of Fame. And so this effort was underway to right that wrong. And a group of baseball writers and historians got together to review the credentials of 40 or 50 Negro League players who had been nominated for the Hall of Fame. And they, narrowed that group down to 20 or so, and finally took a vote. And I guess to get elected, people needed 75% of the vote. And Effa got elected. Interesting, the Hall of Fame initially said they would reveal the results of the voting, like they do now. Certain player gets a certain percentage of the vote. But the Hall of Fame decided in this case not to release any information on who got how many votes. At the same time that this election took place, Buck O'Neill did not get enough votes to become elected in the Hall of Fame, which a lot of people thought he should have. So there's really no way of knowing what percentage of the vote Effa got, but we just know that she got enough to get in. And there was, I am not aware of, a couple of the people I talked to who were in the voting process said they did not see any special favor or disfavor associated with Effa Manley as a woman, as that being any kind of a contributing factor, yay or nay, to her election. But it's all a little murky.
Yeah, that's interesting. And as we've had conversations about various sports and leagues, especially challenger leagues, right, which is a little bit of a different situation. But, you look in the 60s and the 70s with challenger football leagues like the WFL or the AFL and or other situations, WHA and hockey, et cetera, ABA and basketball, right? There's this and we get into sort of, I guess, the politics of halls of fame and official histories and statistics and record keeping and all that, right? So, this to me seems like an even larger sort of issue about how to embrace the past, right? Which, use the word murky. These aren't straight lines, right? The history of baseball, the history of any professional sport in this country, is pockmarked by lots of detours and situations and challenger leagues and maybe mergers and others not so. And then, in looking backward, right, and again, this is another reason why we sort of do these conversations is, does it take, the surviving league and or Hall of Fame to recognize, this history to make it quote unquote official and or worthwhile or worthy? And of course, the answer is, of course not. But then you get into the sort of the particulars of, well, at what point and how do you embrace the past? because the Negro Leagues, right, as we've discussed and hinted at, right, were this parallel, again, in some respects, bizarre sort of world, of baseball, which was in many cases, the highest, if not even higher quality of the major leagues at the time, right? Mm-hmm. But at that time, right, was looked upon, you mentioned it earlier with Branch Rickey and others, looked down upon either for business reasons or for genuine beliefs that, not of high quality, not of great organization, all that kind of stuff, right? Whether you believe that or not. But, years down the road, without the existence of these Negro Leagues, and obviously the players and some of the pioneers like Effa Manley, you wouldn't have some of the innovations and or the opportunities that exist today in Major League Baseball and all these other sports for that matter. So it's a very tenuous sort of, embrace / distancing, right? That sort of goes forward as history. And for me, and I'm not taking any stance here. To me, these teams, these leagues, these people existed, right? And they existed for various reasons, various dreams and ideas, or they saw perhaps things in the status quo that weren't, to their liking, and or saw opportunities, obviously business opportunities, et cetera. And that's all part of the not always convenient history of these sports and stuff. And to me, it seems like this is sort of the mother of all of those, right? In the idea of understanding, recognizing, and embracing truly and deeply the role of the Negro Leagues in the history of the sport of baseball. Yeah, no, right. I would agree. Right. Without those kind of efforts, Negro League would not be well known, and the contributions they made to baseball would not be well known, and Major League Baseball would be a different organization than it is today had there been no Negro Leagues. More interestingness. That's the way I look at it. All these conversations lead me to learn things. Hopefully you get to enjoy sharing some of those learnings. And of course, what they often do is they lead to opening a further Pandora's box for us to investigate further. So rest assured, we will have many more episodes devoted to stories and teams and people from the various Negro Leagues in the weeks and months to come. A fascinating journey into the life of perhaps one of the more notable names in Negro League baseball history, Effa Manley. And again, she is ensconced in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, the first woman to be inducted into that hallowed hall. And if you want to learn more about her story, the book that Bob Luke authored is called, as we've said, The Most Famous Woman in Baseball, Effa Manley and the Negro Leagues. It is published by Potomac Books, and we encourage you to find a copy. You can go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search for this episode with Bob Luke. You will find a link to it. And of course, if you purchase the book through that link on our Amazon link, you'll be given a little bit of scratch to our show as well. So we encourage you to make all your purchases through those links. We'd appreciate that, of course. But regardless of how you get the book, please get it, because it's a very interesting story. And obviously, we did not go as deep as we could have in just an hour's time. Hopefully, we'll get Bob back for another episode. I do want to talk about another team in the Negro Leagues called the Baltimore Elite Giants. And that is another book that Bob has authored. We'll have a link to that book as well. And hopefully we'll use that as an excuse to go further in our discovery of all things, or more things, Negro Leagues. Let's see. We're just about out of time, but I do want to thank our friends at Podfly Productions. That's Eric Begay, Corey Coates, our dulcet-toned announcer, David Gregerson, and the good Dr. Jerry Payne, who puts our various components together to make this show sound pretty darn nice. I have very little to do with that, and he has just about everything to do with that. So thank you to Jerry and all the friends at Podfly, he says, Productions, Podfly Productions. And if you're interested in learning more about how you too can start this wacky world of podcasting, if you're a beginner, an intermediate, an expert. Podfly can help you on all those different realms. And the place to go is podfly.net. Tell them that your pal Tim and the Good Seats Still Available podcast sent you, and they will take very good care of you, I assure you. All right, I'm done for this week. As always, thank you tremendously for listening. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Good Seats Still, on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. On Facebook, there's a page to us as well. And of course, please, your shout outs and your ratings and reviews on wherever you listen, on Apple iTunes or Apple Podcasts especially. Please do so early and often. We appreciate that love too. That helps us tremendously. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week. And until then, I bid you a fond farewell.